When they got that news that they don't have to clear this park.
The police came to occupy Oakland.
Police were on standby, ready to move in.
That sort of ever-creeping surveillance state.
You got fresh credentials?
Capitalism is a realm of social ownership.
Well, we finally reached here on the Adam and Sheridan Show video podcast the third 21st century labor troubles, and that's of course the Occupy Wall Street in the United States, but not just Occupy Wall Street. There were surrounding issues that happened not only in New York City but in Wisconsin and in, of course, the Middle East. So,
but of course, so
I'm Adam Corright, by the way. This is my co-host, Sheridan.
Yes. Thanks.
Forgot to mention us.
Thanks, buddy.
All four people watch.
So essentially, though, it did start out as Occupy Wall Street, and it started out. I'm going to give most of the history to the man who can remember dates, but
sure.
It started out in Zuccotti Park in New York when they were protesting Wall Street financialization and the crash of 2008 that was not getting better. And
yes.
It started in...
The actual occupation of New York City started in September of 2011, but if you actually go back in time to 2010, in January 2011, that was when the Arab Spring began. It began in Tunisia, it began in Egypt, and all of a sudden, through dint of millions of people marching in the streets and in Tahrir Square in Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, who had been the dictator of Egypt for 30 years, was removed. Now, of course, with that vacuum in there, and because there was no leadership in Egypt among the working class, of course, right now there's another dictator, al-Sisi. But the point is that workers were, and everybody was coming out and saying, no, we're not going to take this oppression anymore. And it spread all throughout the Middle East. And then in Wisconsin...
And the Arab Spring actually had problems that would crop up again in the Occupy movement.
Absolutely. Wisconsin sort of had a good idea. This is actually one of the first things that we talked about on our radio show when we first started.
Which was very interesting.
Yeah. There was, as you remember, Scott Walker is still the governor of Wisconsin, and he was trying to get through the legislature a bill that would prevent public employees of the state of Wisconsin to not be able to publicly or to collectively bargain.
Because fiscal reasons.
Right, because we needed to basically cut all of their pensions and wages and benefits.
Balance budget. We needed to fiscally responsibleness.
Right. So
by the way, I hate those reasons.
Those are terrible reasons.
Yeah.
But the unions and the union workers occupied the building, the state capitol, for over a month.
Even after threats from Scott Walker, who was saying he was going to bring in police force and have everybody arrested. It was a very tense time, and it's something that hadn't happened for almost 100 years. For almost 100 years, people had not risen up, occupied a building, gone against the law, and said, we were taking this in our own hands, and we were going to make it happen.
However, we did talk about, in 1936-37, the Flint sit-down strike.
I said almost 100 years.
Well,
I said almost.
You talked about a public building. What Flint did was they actually occupied a private corporation, GM building.
Yep.
And they actually got what they were asking for.
So essentially, Occupy was.
Wisconsin was a failure, so was Occupy. Talk about that.
But essentially, Occupy was the revival of this great American movement of kind of badass protest, because it went to Zuccotti Park, which was it was a public park. It was a public space, and they said, "We are taking this over. We are going to talk about financialization, our runaway economy, how it's not getting better for people who need it to get better. We're going to talk about all these things that haven't been talked about in the media." And they started to build, there was the People's Bookstore or the People's Library. Yep. People were bringing food. There were lawyers who set up tents who were like, if the NYPD is giving you trouble, come here and we will talk about your defense. The People's Defense Council was set up at that point. So Occupy really became a huge thing.
These weren't just a bunch of hippies. These were people that...
Some of them.
They were, but even they were able to have an organized kind of, almost like a little community there, would you say?
And it branched out into not only other cities, but other parts of New York City. So there were street demonstrations. They took over the Brooklyn Bridge for a time. There were mass arrests there. There were a lot of New York... Yeah.
With the nettings. Police would take these giant nets and actually corral protesters into what would eventually be wagons that would take them off to jail.
There were a lot of stories of people who were being told, get on the sidewalk, even though they were on the sidewalk. And because they knew people had cell phone cameras, which was a first for this kind of police activity, they said, get on the sidewalk. They would be on the sidewalk, and then they would say, you're resisting a police officer, and then tackle them and arrest them. So there were a lot of things that were cropping up that were scaring people in power.
They issued a dispersal order, but they didn't actually give people time to disperse, which is a favorite tactic of the NYPD.
Yeah, they had a megaphone, made an announcement, and then immediately, which I couldn't hear, I was there and I couldn't hear it, and then they immediately started violently arresting people.
So I started filming the arrests, at which point a white shirt, which means a lieutenant or above in the NYPD, turned around and said,
"You got press credentials?
No.
Then get in here. Whoa, in here, I said. Fucking put your hands behind your back." Okay.
I and 16 other people were arrested.
I had seen John's arrest. I was about 20 feet away, and I ran over, and he was being handcuffed, and I was standing talking to one of the police officers saying, you just threw him to the ground, you violently arrested him, all he was doing was taking pictures. And a cop looked down at me. A cop had just told another protester, get out of my face, get out of my face. And after that protester walked away, and I continued to say, why did you arrest him? The cop looked down at me and said, I have a gun on me. I don't need people getting that close to me.
As inspiring as the movement was, there were some problems with it.
Yes, the problems, unfortunately, have to do with something that Occupy explicitly rejected, which was the idea of leadership. Now, if you look at, let's say, Flint, or let's say the Teamster strike in Minnesota that we talked about in our last podcast, which you can view probably over, is it over there, I guess, on that side of the screen?
Something.
They explicitly rejected the idea of a leadership and the process of debating, the process of forming councils and talking democratically back and forth about what their demands are, having specific demands, writing them down, voting on them, and then once they're voted on and agreed to, pushing for them independently of the Democratic and Republican parties.
And essentially, people were also not looking to the parties. So one big failing that I saw was that a lot of people, even though their speakers were talking about systemic problems and that capitalism was tied with the current existing social structure and power, what people were talking about was the banksters. They were saying, Jim Hightower, who has a show on WRFA, or radio station, or who's syndicated on WRFA. He keeps talking about the banksters and hijacking our economy, and that was essentially the rhetoric there. Yeah. Even though they had people like David Harvey and people like Slavoj Žižek talking about the fact that you need broad systemic change and you need a political action or a political form of action. It kind of lost steam until the movement started to fizzle, and then people finally radicalized.
So basically, the conclusion is that this is a fantastic thing that happened. I in my lifetime, I've never seen anything like it. There's just been
few have seen
3 decades of just stagnant, no action whatsoever on the part of the working class, and this is a huge, giant movement. Not only in New York, but it was everywhere. I remember there was an Occupy Fargo.
Yep, Occupy Fargo, Occupy Oakland was
yeah,
one of
that
the
was a
most
violent
radical
one, yeah.
parts. Well, no, they were radical.
Not them,
because
but the police.
the
against
police
them,
were
yeah.
extremely violent.
Yeah.
You have Occupies all over, including in our hometown, Jamestown.
Yes.
But it's a movement that is difficult to characterize because it didn't take advantage of the political moment at the time.
Right. And, it
And
was
is
in the
now
air.
trying to come back from that.
And you remember that we're up against a lot here. We're up against two big business parties that represent the Wall Street that you were trying to, speaking now to the occupiers if they're watching, that you were trying to get them to step down or change that whole system. Those two parties are organized. They do what I just said. They debate, they talk, they vote on how they want to proceed, and then they move together as a party. That giant organization moves together. That's what we need to start doing. We outnumber the 1% in numbers. That's just arithmetic. There's hundreds of millions of us. There's if you look at the 1%, there's not that many of them.
But
So we need to organize as a party. We need to have specific demands, and we need to have leadership, and we need to be independent of the two big business parties and the media. And we need to, I would say we need to form our own media online and even our own newspaper.
exactly.
So-
And but in light of all that, they still did give us. They spurred a protest movement, which is still gaining steam.
Absolutely.
And they gave us a way of talking
The whole
that
concept of
hadn't
1%,
existed before.
right?
The concept of 1%. The concept. They re-gave us the concept of class war.
Yeah.
So.
All right, I'm Adam Courtwright. This is the Adam and Sheridan Show. You can catch our radio show, by the way. We're going to talk more about these issues. Friday nights at 6 p.m. and Sunday mornings at 11. It's a re-air.
Yep.
It's WRFALP.com if you want to stream it online, or WRFALP 107.9 FM if you're in the Jamestown area. We're also on Facebook, too.
It's a wonderful station. Check it out. Definitely. We're on Facebook, of course. We're on Twitter. And email us. Did we say that?
adamandsheridanshow@gmail.com. We will respond. We will read your letter on the air or right here on this podcast. And by the way, I just touched my ear like this. This is a signal to the NSA.
And that message is in the form of a poem called Dear NSA.
Dear NSA, you make our day by watching what we have to say. We know you're there and we don't care if you take our metadata today.
We might be crude, but we're not rude. So not to disappoint your brood, for our next show, we'll have you know, we'll do the entire thing in the nude.
Everything at home in the box just got lost. Where is it? Come on. Sorry, that was dumb.
You are a fool. All right, so we're going to be setting up for this, and I'm hoping we can do the whole.
We can do the hokey pokey, or we'll turn ourselves around and march
That's what
right
it's all
outside the
about.
door. Are we
Okay.
okay here with the framing?
Yeah, good framing. I like it.
Okay.
I think it's good.
Oh, yeah, text message from whom?